This is the fourth, actually, in the series on Through Women's Eyes. And next week, I wanted to just remind everyone that Diane Buchanan is going to be leading the discussion, and we're going to be talking about the abortion issue. And she is using as a reference point a book by Dr. Willie Parker called A Moral Choice, or let me get it exactly right. Life's Work, A Moral Argument for Choice. So that is the name of the book. And if you can get it, it might be a good idea to look over it, although that is not a requirement for next week's class, but I think it should be an interesting discussion, as I hope today's class is as well, because today we're going to be talking about feminist theology. And I just wanted to say, as I've said to this group before, the big disclaimer is that I have no expertise in this area. However, I'm going to go ahead now and share my screen with you.
While Marianne's working on that, I just take a second to say for next week that really our discussion will really revolve around Dr. Willie Parker's conversion in his thinking on the abortion issue. It's not, I don't want it to be a debate on the rightness or wrongness of abortion or what we all think about it. Although, you know, it might be impossible to talk about it without touching on it at some level. It's really about Willie Parker's book. That being said, so if it's a little book, it's not maybe 180 pages. It's an amazing, amazing book, and but you don't have to have read it for next week.
Okay, there, I think we have what we intended to have now. So with that said, that the disclaimer that this is not my area of expertise at all, but as a woman, I can certainly bring a female experience to answering this first question. And that is a question that Jesus asked in we see it in more than one of the books of the New Testament. Who do you say that I am? And he is asking his disciples. And feminists might answer this, and women in general might answer this question differently than men. Maybe not, but, and certainly within feminist thought, there's a huge range. So today we're going to be talking about just a few of the people who have written about feminism in religions of all kinds. And I think that's important to know too, that there is a feminist thought process through virtually all religious traditions. Even the Eastern traditions have feminist theologians now. And feminists might answer, as I said, slightly differently, and look upon Jesus as the liberator, the healer, the one that empowers, and the one who sends us. Christology, how women look at Jesus can be a problem. I mean, in a religion that is based on the metaphor of father and son. So that is just the first thing that I want to say, that I think women, perhaps based on their female experience, will bring a different answer, perhaps, to that question. So the first part of this talk is going to we're going to look at the problems associated with Christianity in particular, from a woman's viewpoint or a feminist viewpoint. And these are the particular things that I have picked out to talk about. Not that this is not any surprise to anybody. Sexism, patriarchy, androcentric authors and theologians, that is men writing for men primarily, and language and metaphor, which for me, I've always thought was a real challenge for women within Christianity. So within sexism, here is how we might define sexism with discrimination, marginalization, exclusion, invisibility, and treatment, whether good or bad, based on gender. The next one of these problems is patriarchy. And Mary Coons talked about this when she was talking about women of the Bible. So patriarchy being the power of the fathers, a cultural construct, and it's been shaped by males for males. And the power is held by males. And the rules are made by males. And the norm, and I think this is one of the particular problems that rises to the top within Christianity, is that the model human, oftentimes when we read scripture or when we read anything that is talking basically about our theology, that the model human is the adult male. Women are not considered fully human, and in many times they have been defined by the relationships to males in the culture. So they are the sister, they are the wife, they are the daughter of. So many times within the cultures that have come down through the ages, they are defined by their relationships. And of course, the result of this patriarchy is that there is oppression, there is injustice, and there is exploitation. Let me get the next one here. So another one of the problems is how women have been spoken of within Christianity. And here you have a few examples of what has been said about women. Tertullian, who I was not familiar with, but he was a 2nd century theologian, wrote of women that they were the devil's gateway. So that was the evil. I mean, it gets back to the Eve story, the trope that we see of Eve being the beginning of all evil. And that was how women were defined even as early as the 2nd century. Augustine wrote, woman is in the image of God only when taken together with the man who is himself in the image of God, or imago Dei. So the image of God as portrayed or as written about by Augustine, excuse me, is in fact, again, relational. It's only the woman is only looked at in relationship and is only fully human when seen through the relationship that she has with a man who is the head. Aquinas, this is an interesting term, referred to women as misbegotten males. So somehow women just weren't quite whole. They were not wholly human. They were a mistake, sort of. And then we have the entire binary opposition. This has been referred to over the years, the mind body, the reason passion, and male and female. So somehow the female persona was more involved with passion instead of reason. A woman can't think through things as reasonably as a man. She is more emotional. I mean, we hear this all the time. A woman is not as intellectually capable as a man. And then we have the language metaphor problem that I think is huge. So feminist authors argue that it's not persuasive, or it is not persuasive simply to declare that the concept of God transcends gender, and therefore he is not literally male, then to presume that all can go on as before. And I think if we stop and really ask ourselves, is this in fact what happens within our church even, which I feel is a very progressive church, but do we have these discussions where we say, oh yeah, we don't really, we think God's beyond gender. We don't really believe that he's a an older white man with a beard living on a cloud. I mean, we are beyond that. But we do sort of say that periodically and then go on as before. We don't really give enough thought and enough practice, enough change in ritual, perhaps, to really make a difference in how we hear what we're talking about when we speak of God. So the problem remains that once the masculine is raised to the universal beyond gender, then the feminine alone bears the burden of the sexual difference. So it falls back to the woman, to the person who has been oppressed, to somehow say, wait a minute, I'm not that. I'm not that you are thinking about. So it puts the burden on the female. And I see this in many ways, like we have done with minorities, racial minorities in this country, saying, well, it's your problem to fix it. You know, it's not the position. We don't, as white people, oftentimes we don't say it's our problem. It's like, well, it's your problem. You need to be better educated. You need to raise yourself. You need to change who you are. Many feminist thinkers have even gone so far as to say that the idea of the concept of the male God is humanly oppressive and religiously idolatrous.
It's all right, I'm just.
So the idea being that we are told that we should have no idols, but yet we build up this idea of a powerful male figure as our God. And some feminists would argue that this is, in fact, an idolatrous idea. So the second part of this metaphor language problem and the problem of God, as it's written about here, is that God, no matter what we say, remains a stubbornly gendered male. And that within that even, there are hierarchical patterns that are established. So not only is God a male, but he is the father, he is the king, he is the Lord, he is the bridegroom, he's the husband. So some of these metaphors also put him above other males. So it's not a oneness, it's not a feeling of sameness, a feeling of a intertwined relationship, even within, if you just keep it within the male gender. The other thing that feminists write about is the idea of this domination, the omnipotence, the power, and that these are traditionally characteristics of ideal masculinity. So again, this puts, even if we try to erase the gender, the maleness, and think in terms of either a neutrality or some sort of androgynous attribute to God, it's still, there are just problems along the way. I mean, no matter how you try to parse it and change how we look at it, it has remained a problem in Christianity. So now, identifying all of those problems that we have raced over here, this is a couple of definitions of feminist Christian theology, one by Claire Smith, the other by Janet Ruffing. Theology that seeks the equality, justice, and liberation of women from what are said to be parochial or androcentric systems of power and domination that have shaped the church, the history of translation, and the interpretation of the Bible. So that is certainly the aim or the goal of most feminist Christian theology, is equality, justice, and liberation of women. And I put this one in, and I read quite a bit of the work of Ruffing, not quite a bit, but I read some of what she has said. And I like this one because she says feminist theologians look to the future. And so they are advocating a vision of a new human cooperation based on values of mutuality and reciprocity. And I like these two words a lot, mutuality and reciprocity. And I think that's important, that those are the things, those are the goals, that whether you consider yourself a feminist or not, but certainly within the church, we should be looking at approaching problems in that way. So here is a very quick history of feminist Christian theology. As I said, the idea of feminist theology exists within Judaism, it exists within Islam, within many of the Eastern religions as well. But this is more or less aimed at secular feminist Christian theology as well as Christian theology, and there's an overlap. So there are some of these people that certainly do not consider themselves to be Christian. I think Mary Wollstonecraft would be one of them, but most of these people would be interacting at least at the level of Christian theology. So we know, and we've talked about this certainly in the past, in this class, in this series, and in other classes, that early on in the church, immediately after Jesus's death, that there were women who served in the early churches as missionaries, as preachers, as teachers, prophets, apostles, healers, and perhaps most importantly, as leaders of house churches. I mean, there were not churches, physical churches, there were not buildings in the first few decades after and the beginning of Christianity, but people met in houses. And the houses, as Mary told us about, were certainly, that was the purview of women in that day, in the culture. The women, that was their little niche in life, was the churches. So the fact that were the houses, excuse me. So for them to hold services, to have discussions, to have classes, however you want to define what was going on then, it was women who were leading many of those. But then something happened. I mean, we see change that happened within the church. And then, as Jeannie reminded us in talking last week about the women mystics, the women mystics kind of were off. Many of them, not all, but many of them were doing their own thing. I mean, they were busy. They were doing their own thing in speaking about not only God images, but also in speaking of Christ. And so they continued to be strong leaders in many cases. But then again, we sort of forgot about them. They sort of got pushed to the background. We didn't hear that much about women mystics for a long time, certainly within our particular brand of Christianity. And then early on, and I didn't want to leave this out, George Fox, who lived from 1624 to 1691, was the initiator of the Quaker movement. And the Quaker movement has always held a very different view of women and how women should participate in their services, in their missionary, what they did within, and later on also with the first wave of feminism. But the Quaker movement was very important within the Christian tradition of raising women to a different level. There was a term that I'm not sure if he came up with it, but it was used within the early Quaker churches, and it was called help meet, not help mate, but help meet. And that was a term used to talk about the mutuality of women and men working together, doing these things that the church was doing at the time. I included here Mary Wollstonecraft, who was a feminist philosopher during the Enlightenment. And for some of you may know this, I did not. She is the mother of Mary Shelley. And she actually died right after Mary Shelley's birth, probably as a result of the pregnancy and the delivery. But anyway, she was a feminist philosopher who lived a very unconventional life, but wrote a lot about women's equality and how women should be perceived in an early time. Then we have the first wave of secular feminist thought, and this came about at the same time as the abolitionist movement, the suffrage movement, which went on for a long time. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who is was involved with the Seneca Falls Collective. Actually, she and a group of other women, many of them scholars, wrote the Women's Bible in 1895, and it is available online. I would say if you're interested in looking at it, you can look at it for free. You don't have to buy it, but you can actually read some of it online, and it's very interesting and scathing I would term it, in some areas, in how they perceive the way the Bible was written. And their effort in this instance was to try to correct some of what they saw as very androcentric ways of looking at scripture. The second wave of feminists, many of us on this screen were around at this time and were aware of it. And it was in the late 60s, early 70s, correlated with the civil rights movement, but much of it actually grew out of the liberation theology in South America and Central America. So it was all connected in the 60s and 70s with what was going on around the rest of the world. But interestingly, this second wave was mostly concerned with white middle-class women. So in the third and fourth wave of feminism, beginning in the 1990s, all of a sudden, or I shouldn't say all of a sudden, but we see it change, it seems, but it had been based on this background of women of color and different cultural backgrounds and different sexualities saying, wait a minute, this stuff doesn't necessarily apply to me. You know, when you're talking about women who stay home and take care of their kids, I've been working every day in a low-income job. So we need to talk about other things besides what you're talking about. So this is the third and fourth wave of feminism. And there then developed these other terms. And one of them is the womanist theology. And this was proposed by African-American women, specifically Alice Walker, and has to do with problems that are associated with specific problems within the African-American community. The mujerista theology was then proposed by a Cuban American woman, but also then was taken up by Latinas. And the Minjung feminist theology was proposed by Korean women, and the delete feminist theology is specific to the low caste Indian women, or the untouchables, known as the untouchables. One of the things that's important when we talk about feminist Christian theology is the intersectionality, and that is that all of these things refer to the dynamics of power and privilege, but they also have, the whole idea has broadened itself out to include problems with race, ethnicity, and class, with sexuality, disability, looking at things within the post-colonial world that we live in, and very much a part of the feminist Christian theology has been what has been termed ecofeminism. And that is the concern that many women have for the environment. That this has gone so far as to include panentheism and the look at a creator spirit. There is an emphasis within feminist Christian theology of creation, the creator spirit, looking at God in this way. So the feminist hermeneutics, how are we then supposed to look at scripture if we look through a feminist eyes? And this is what has been fairly well accepted by a number of feminist writers, is looking at with a hermeneutic of suspicion, to read against the text, not to accept that the text, as we've been taught to interpret it, necessarily means what it means. So reading against the text, and also the suspicion of saying that you make the assumption that there is a male patriarchal or anti-woman bias in scripture. I mean, that's just the culture that was happening at the time, and just assume these were men writers writing for men. But then the hermeneutic of retrieval suggests the recovery and veneration of some of the lost history of the Bible and the church, recognizing the things that women did and have done throughout history. So part of this is going back to the mystics, for instance, recognizing and recovering this information. And another part of this retrieval is looking at the suffering of women in scripture. You know, outside of Mary, Mother of Jesus, we don't really think a lot about the suffering that women experienced when we read their stories in the Bible. Then the hermeneutic of reconstruction gets to, how are we going to deal with this now? How should we be looking at things now? And one thing is to revise tradition and to look at it from a more woman-centric approach. So the feminist, as I mentioned, and as Jeannie certainly talked about, the mystics certainly have talked about God in a different way. They have felt called, they have felt empowered by their Christian religion. You might have to take her. This is my cat coming in to complain. Anyway, she's a female too, and she has many complaints, believe me. So here are some examples of women who have been empowered and called in one way or another. Joan of Arc, Teresa of Avila, Catherine of Siena, Julian of Norwich, and Gertrude the Great. All of these in different ways. All of these women contributed to our Christian faith. Let me see if I can get, I want to get out of here. When I'm on this screen, let me see if I can do something here. Let me just do this. If I were more clever, I could do this in a different way, I think. There we go. There, now I can read the whole thing. Okay, Hildegard of Bingen wrote that the divine spirit is the very life of all creatures. And I particularly liked this thing that she wrote. She is life, the she being the divine spirit. Movement, color, radiance, restorative stillness in the den. Her power makes all withered sticks and souls green again with the juice of life. She purifies, absolves, strengthens, heals, gathers the perplexed, seeks the lost. She pours the juice of contrition into hardened hearts. She plays music in the soul, being herself the melody of praise and joy. She awakens mighty hope, blowing everywhere the winds of renewal in creation. I mean, what an outstanding vision of God. Julian of Norwich, in talking of Christ, says, "But our true Mother Jesus, he alone bears us for joy and for endless life. Blessed may he be. So he carries us within him in love and travail." So that is her vision of the Christ. Within Judaism, Sakena, and I'm not sure, of course, if that's the correct pronunciation, but it refers to the cloud of Yahweh. In the Bible is a synonym for God's present in the rabbinic tradition and is a feminine hypostasis or grounding in the Kabbalah, is a popular theological image in contemporary Jewish feminist circles. So the form of Sakena is the goddess and the singular image that is sufficiently adaptable for postmodern feminist interpreters. So this is the goddess of Jewish feminism, although there's some question as to how this goddess came into being, but it's probably a holdover from, at least from what I read, before Judaism was monotheistic. So at some point, it is believed that within Judaism, there were additional gods and goddesses. This one, I think, speaks to us as people who live in the Southwest, certainly. This is a woman, Paula Gunn Allen, who is Laguna Pueblo and Sioux. And she says, "There is a spirit that pervades everything, that is capable of powerful song and radiant movement, and that moves in and out of the mind. The colors of the spirit are multitudinous, a glowing, pulsing rainbow. Old Spider Woman is one name for this quintessential spirit, and Serpent Woman is another. And what they together have made is called creation, earth, creatures, plants, and light." So this is just a few of the feminist authors who have written about reimagining God. Rosemary used an unpronounceable symbol. It kind of reminded me of Prince, when Prince took on the symbol that he used instead of his name. But anyway, she used a symbol that encompassed a matrix of being that went beyond or transcended a patriarchal limitation. The idea by Sally McFaig, I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, but is mother, lover, and friend, that is a metaphor for God. Mary Daly, who ultimately, she was Catholic, but she ultimately left the Christian church altogether because she couldn't get comfortable with, no matter how she tried to change her own feelings about certain things within Christianity, she finally felt that she couldn't do that anymore. But anyway, she used the notion that had certainly been put out by, has been established by Paul Tillich, of God as a verb. Then we can't discount the idea of Sophia, or wisdom. And that has been used even within the Presbyterian church and within many Christian traditions, looking at God as Sophia, or wisdom. Goddess, we don't hear that too much within Christianity. I think there's been a thought process that says that is too pagan, perhaps, to use the idea of goddess. But there have been some feminists who have suggested that we don't talk about theology, that we talk about theology, because thea is the feminine of theology. Then, of course, creator, redeemer, and sustainer. I think all of us, no matter male or female, can think in terms of creator, redeemer, and sustainer in terms of who we believe or what we believe God to be. Imago Dei, and this is the image of God, the idea that the early church talked a lot about this, that we as humans are formed within the image of God, but it has to be reinterpreted so that all genders are reflected. And this is the final slide that I have, and then we'll go back, and I'd really like to have a little bit of a discussion in the minutes that we have left. And I know we've gone through this really quickly, but I think for many of you, this is not new stuff, that you are aware of much of this. But this is from Rosemary Radford Ruther, who has written a lot. And this is from a book called Sexism and God Talk. The critical principle of feminist theology is the promotion of the full humanity of women. Theologically speaking, whatever diminishes or denies the full humanity of women must be presumed not to reflect the divine, or an authentic relation to the divine, or to reflect the authentic nature of things, or to be the message or work of an authentic redeemer or a community of redemption. So I like this idea, which has been quoted a lot by other people, the promotion of the full humanity of women. And I think that for most, if not all, women can be agreed to, that this is something that we all would like to experience, is the full humanity of women working in mutuality with men and other genders. So again, I think we've zipped through this pretty quickly, but if any of you have comments or questions, unmute yourself first, but I would love to hear what you have to say. Margaret?
One of the writers that I like to read on theology as well as mystery stories is Dorothy L. Sayers, and she had an interesting paragraph, and it was the end of her essay on called "Are Women Human?" And she and she did an intensive study of the Gospels when she wrote the series of radio plays called "The Man Born to Be King," which was about the life of Jesus. And she pointed out that when you actually go to the Gospels, Jesus relates to women. He doesn't put them down. He relates them to human to human. He doesn't. She says there's never been a man like that before.
Well,
he didn't patronize women. He had them in his ministry, and he related to them like human beings.
And that's the reason I began with that one slide that says that I think that you can look upon Jesus as the first feminist. And if you look upon Jesus as the reflection of God, we certainly, as Trinitarians, then we have to assume, I think, that there is not a gender within God. I just don't think we can do that, but yet we are stuck with these pronouns that we have to use, and it makes it difficult to have the conversations. But I think you're right in everything that was written about Jesus, the human Jesus, and the interactions that he had with other people, especially with women. He was, he treated them very differently than they were being treated by other men living in that time period, in that culture.
Oh, also in the Jewish, I would pronounce that Shekhinah.
Well, I was going to ask one of my Jewish friends the other day, and then I forgot. So, but I like that metaphor. I like the idea of the wind blowing through, and it's a very nice metaphor, I think.
Yeah, you can tell by I've done a little study of Hebrew, and you can tell by the form of the word that it's, Hebrew has grammatical gender, and that one is that word is gendered female, gendered feminine. Yeah, I should say feminine, not female, because feminine is what you use for grammatical gender.
Elise had a question, or
Well, I have a huge compliment, Marianne. What a robust overview you've given us.
I'll second that.
And I think all of us within this, I'm seeing Marianne Lundy on the screen. I'm so interested in feminine form being recovered and perhaps embedded into our ritual practice and even the architecture. More circles than rows, more faces than more participation than assumption of experts. But Marianne, might you share with us the reimagining, some of the elements that the reimagining effort was out to recover? And that's a big order in a few minutes, but in terms of form.
Well, I think you're right. I think in terms of, if you're speaking of a form of perception of a deity that is softer, that is rounder, that is not that we don't see violence, that we associate it, or power, or and I shouldn't say, because power can be different things. I mean, you can have soft power. You can be powerful without being brutal. You can be powerful in ways that are not destructive, or I'm not sure exactly, Elise, if that's what you're saying, but I know that there has been within the like you said, you mentioned art and architecture, and I think that certainly we could do better than we have done. And part of the problem within Protestantism, I think, is we don't have statuary. We have kept things very simple, which is good. And I mean, in the Reformation, a lot, what was changed, simplified, or at least it was aimed at simplifying what our churches look like. But as it was Alice that mentioned a week or so ago, I'm not sure when this was, Alice, but you were talking about when the Presbyterian Church met within the Catholic Church. Would you like to just tell people that story?
Sure. I will always remember when we looked for a place to hold our services while we were rebuilding, and we settled upon Rosario Chapel. And the very first service that we had there, our then Minister Sheila Gustafson, just paused at the beginning and looked around at the statuary and the pictures of the saints. And she said, how wonderful to see the feminine side of religion again. And Marianne, you were probably there that day, Marianne Lundy.
One of the most important events in terms of American theology, I think, was the 1993 conference. It was an international conference sponsored by the World Council of Churches called Reimagining God, Jesus, and the Church. And it brought together 2,000 women and men in Minneapolis for conversations and marvelous, marvelous speakers. The Presbyterian Church itself brought 62 speakers. We were one of the beginning organizers of the conference. And it did more, the Christian Century magazine said that it was the most important event theologically for the church in 50 years in the US. And we could go on and on. I mean, we could do a whole section just on this. Mary Kuhns was also there. There may have been, Jane, were you there? Bill Humphreys, were you there? There were lots of people. And actually Santa Fe Church had 12 people who were there. One of the larger delegations, actually. We experienced really a life-changing event in that conference in terms of all of us and how it changed our view as we experienced. We didn't just talk about it, we experienced it in terms of ritual and conversations that took place over the 3-day period. It changed all our lives. I think there's no question about that. And has gone on within all of the churches through the World Council of Churches. There were several conferences held after that in terms of understanding what was happening in churches around feminist theology and what we didn't know about from one country to another. And it really changed, I think, for many of the 2,000 people there, it really changed our whole life. A view about what we believed, how we could express it, what it meant to us in terms of day-to-day Christian living. And it's very hard really still for me to talk about it because it was such an important theological event in the life of Christianity around the world, really. Mary, you might want to talk about that too. Mary Kuhns was also there. Were there other people? Diane, were you there? Diane's dad wrote a lot about it in the Christian Century.
Yeah.
After that.
I don't even know if my dad was there. I'm going to
No,
ask.
he wasn't there, but he chaired the committee later, deciding whether it was heretical or not in terms of Presbyterian Church. He sort of saved my life in terms of the Presbyterian Church. Anyway, it was very controversial because it was so new. Mary, yeah. Mary, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it reinvigorated a lot of people. Yeah, I am. I think it invigorated a lot of people, me being one of them, because for me, worship had gotten very stale. Even though I was participating still on staff, I found the whole worship experience fairly boring. And this, the conference really reinvigorated it to me, showed me a variety of different things that can be done experientially, conversation wise, theology wise. So it was mind blowing, I guess, is what mind and spirit blowing.
What, for those of you who experienced this, what do you think that we could bring to our church, to First Presbyterian, that we have not done to make it more relevant in terms of ritual or in terms of our worship service?
I think one of the things that happened in all the churches, and there were Roman Catholic women there, that they were a significant part of the conference, and there were, we called them 80 good men who were there. And I think that for all of us, it created a new community across the country that was ecumenical, that looked at what were the old ways in which we had done things, how could we be more inclusive, how could we change the language we used, and it promoted and prompted a lot of controversy. This was not easy. It was not anything that that was taken lightly by the denominations, as well as the Roman Catholics and the Jewish women and men who were there. So the changes that took place were language, a lot of questioning of language that we used in the morning services. Small communities of women formed across the country and looked at how they expressed their faith, what were the kinds of things they'd been emphasizing that were more negative than positive. So in and of itself, it's a whole study. I think it's almost difficult to talk about it. There's a lot been written about it. I just gave all my boxes of material from that I was director of the women's unit of the Presbyterian Church at that time, and so became a part of originating the conference. So the Presbyterian Church probably took more hits from that conference than any other denomination, both positively and negatively. It became a very great source of both controversy and joy for women and men in the church. And it probably still has repercussions going. But there are a lot of things we could talk about. It's probably a whole piece in and of itself. I shouldn't take more time.
Well, I think we are in fact over our time, but I appreciate all of you being here today and for your contributions. And I would very much like to continue the conversation at some point in the future to talk about now that we know a little bit, perhaps, I hope, a little bit more about this, how we can maybe institute some changes that within our services that make things more relevant, that make things more exciting for women, especially. So thank you all very much for coming today. I really appreciate your comments and seeing so many bright faces here after missing an hour of sleep.